A poor woman let a cowboy and his little baby stay for one night. That was all it was meant to be, one mercy, offered under a quilt of stars that stretched so wide it could have swallowed all the sorrows they carried. Ada Finch had little more than a one-room shack by Lone Tree Creek and the stubborn belief that small kindnesses mattered. The roof leaked. The stove hiccuped. There was nothing pretty to it but the way the cottonwood leaves hushed the wind and the way the evening light brushed the doorway like it was fond of her. Ada had learned to make do, to keep a kettle singing and a corner swept, even when coins ran thin as thread. She'd been alone long enough to know the quiet by its many names. Some days the quiet sounded like the creak of her chair or the whisper of flour on a board. Some days it wore the thudding gait of a horse moving slow along the creek. Tonight it was the softened knock on her door just as the sun bled out behind the buttes. When she opened it, the sky was bruised purple and the wind smelled like sage. A man stood there, hat in hand, dust in his lashes, his shirt darkened by a baby cradled against his chest. The child's cheeks were chapped, her mouth rooting even in sleep at the worn edge of his bandana. "Mom," he said, voice low and polite as a prayer, "we won't trouble you long. Just need a roof for the night. My name's Cole Hart. This here's Pearl." Ada stepped aside before he finished, because the child's small sigh flooded her with a heat both sweet and aching. "Set your gear down by the stove," she said. "The night bites harder than it shows." She took the baby like she was a warm loaf to be held close, careful of the tiny fists that unfurled and gripped at her as if the world might slip away if she didn't catch it. The cabin filled with a new sound, the soft, breathy hiccup of a sleeping infant and the creak of leather as Cole settled onto the stool. She ladled out the last of a rabbit stew and pretended not to notice how he watched the food like he'd been going easy on himself to make it last for the little one. He ate slowly, grateful and sheepish. Pearl stirred, pursed her mouth, and let out a fretful whisper. Ada wetted a corner of linen, wiped the dust from the baby's eyelids, and hummed a tune her mother had hummed before leaving this earth. Cole's eyes lifted from the bowl, softened by the firelight and something else he didn't have words for yet. He told her a little, the way people do when the night leans close, how Pearl's mother, Rosalie, had smiled through a cough that wouldn't quit until one day it did and took her along, how he'd promised at the graveside to carry their daughter to a place where kindness grew like cottonwood and water ran, or how he'd been following jobs like a dog follows a scent, a faint, hopeful, stubborn. Ada listened, spoon moving slow, heart remembering its own tender absence. There was a small box under her bed with a knitted cap folded tight as a secret. She had not kept many things from the baby who never drew breath, but the cap held a kind of softness she could not bear to throw away. She didn't tell him that. She just teased Pearl more snugly against her chest, the baby's breath warm as a little stove, and said, "You're both safe here tonight." Cole meant to sit watch, he said. Meant to keep to habits that had kept them alive in the soft hours when coyotes and loneliness moved just outside the thin walls of a stranger's shelter. But Ada's stove and the lull of a woman's voice unwound him. He laid his head on his rolled coat by the hearth and watched Ada rock Pearl. He told himself he was only keeping count of the baby's breaths. He fell asleep counting her breaths and woke once to find Ada tucking a quilt over him the way a person tucks sorrow into a gentler place. At dawn, the light came pale and honest. Ada had coffee on and biscuit dough worked up before the baby's first complaint of the day. Cole had already split kindling and repaired the sagging hinge on her door with a bit of rawhide and a spare nail from his kit. He didn't crow about it, just put his hat back on and stood there looking like he'd fixed something in himself too. Pearl sucked her fingers and watched the world with grave interest. When Cole offered payment, Ada shook her head. "You need those coins more than I do." He set a silver quincho from his belt on her shelf anyway, embarrassed and stubborn both. The way his fingers lingered on the quincho told her it wasn't nothing. Perhaps it was the only pretty thing he owned. The road called him. That's what roads do. He thanked her. Pearl gurgled a parting sound, a little bubbling goodbye, and Ada felt the tug of it all the way down to the place where love had once been nothing but longing. When they were gone, the house felt wider and emptier, the morning too quiet even with the creek speaking and the cottonwood whispering their usual secrets. Ada took up the broom and told herself stories about what comes next. They were good stories, the kind you make to keep your hands from shaking. She did not expect to see them again. Days slid into one another like cards, and Ada patched shirts for cowhands who paid in nickels and thanks. She walked to town for flour and was offered a place in a saloon kitchen, but the idea of chopping onions for men with eyes like rough water didn't sit right. One afternoon, when the sun was a soft gold slung low across the prairie, hoofbeats shook the dust in a familiar way. Cole rode in leading a borrowed wagon. In it, rough-cut boards, a sack of feed, a little rocker somebody's wife must have given up, and a new bucket that gleamed like a bright thought. "Got a line on steady work at the bar double T," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "I'd be obliged if you let me pay you back in kind. Fence mending, roof patching, or whatever you'll allow." Ada folded her arms so he wouldn't see her hands tremble. "And where will you sleep, Colehart?" His smile was simple and shy. "Out by the cottonwood if you say number. On the floor by your stove if you say maybe." He looked toward Pearl where she sat in the wagon, fist deep in her mouth and eyes like creekstone. "She knows your voice, Miss Ada." "I reckon she's partial." "Maybe," Ada said, because Hope was a tender creature and she didn't trust herself not to spook it. "You pay in work. I'll take in washing and we'll see." They saw. They saw how a cabin brightens when a man with capable hands patches its tired places. They saw how a child learns the slow swoop of a rocking chair and the taste of cornbread baked in iron. At night, Cole's low murmur and Ada's soft humming met in the air above Pearl's cradle like two birds sitting easy on the same branch. Cole told her, on an afternoon when clouds stacked high and blue thundered at the edges of the world, about Rosalie's laugh and the way every trail since her death had felt like a map that always led back to a sorrow he couldn't talk himself around. Ada told him, with the kettle rattling just enough to cover the tremor in her voice, about the baby whose life had been nothing more than weight and warmth and then a silence you carry forever. They did not say the word love. They didn't need to. It grew like the beans Ada planted along the fence line. Cole hammered straighter inch by inch, unseen until one morning the whole thing was green and alive. One night the baby burned hot as a coal. Pearl's skin flushed, her eyes glassy. Ada's heart knocked so hard it made her clumsy. Cole's hands shook as he dampened cloths and muttered everything he knew how to pray. The moon was up and merciless. "We'll ride," Ada said, already cramming her feet into boots. "Doc Harlan's in town." 5 miles. Cole bundled Pearl against his chest, and Ada climbed up behind, her arms around both of them as Windy, Cole's mule, found a pace steady and long. The prairie opened like a page. Coyotes sang something sharp. Ada pressed her cheek to Pearl's head, whispered a promise that was half lullaby and half holla, "You're not leaving. Not you." At the doctor's lamplit office, Harlan listened, peered, and smiled his soft old man smile. "Teething fever," he said. "Scared you good?" "She's strong." Ada rubbed her thumb along Pearl's little ribs, feeling every breath like it belonged to all of them. Back home, Pearl slept heavy and damp against Ada's chest while Cole sat with his head bowed, elbows on his knees, swallowing gratitude like it hurt. He lifted his gaze and said the bravest thing he'd ever said. "I don't know how to let people stay. Everyone goes. I'm tired of leaving first to keep from being the one left." Ada touched the old scar on the back of his hand, a white line that looked like a river seen from far away. "Then we won't leave," she said simply, and the words made the room feel warmer. Spring came wearing cottonwood fluff and the sweet mud smell of a creek waking up. Cole built a proper pen and a clothesline that didn't sag. Ada's beans climbed. The rocker found its rhythm. Sometimes, after supper, Cole would take a worn Bible from his saddlebag and read the parts about truth and harvests. He was careful, always careful, the kind of man who asked if he could lay his hat down on her table like it might press a dent in the wood that would never lift. "May I court you, Miss Ada?" he asked one evening, voice too respectful to be entirely steady. Pearl had just pulled herself up on the chair and laughed like a creek over fresh stones. Ada was not a girl. She didn't flutter. She measured things. She measured his kindness, the way he went quiet to listen, the way he held Pearl like she was made of the same starlight that lit the world and could go out if mishandled. "You may," she said, and laughter rose in her chest like a flock taking off. They stood under the cottonwood the day they married, with 2 ranch hands for witnesses and Doc Harlan looking pleased to say words outside of sickness. The tree's leaves shook out a kind of music. Cole had braided a ring of horsehair, black and cream, sturdy and simple. "I ain't good at fancy," he said, slipping it onto her finger, "but I'm good at steady." Ada's dress was the same blue calico she wore every Sunday, ironed crisp. Pearl, in a washed and mended white frock, clapped at the end because everyone else did. They ate cornbread and dried peaches, and someone's wife sent a jar of preserves with the label peeled off so it could be wrapped up like something of consequence. It was, for the way a sweetness can find a tongue and make it believe in seasons again. At dusk, when the fiddler from the bar Double D lifted his bow and found a waltz, Ada rested her cheek against Cole's chest and felt how a life settles into itself when 2 people lean the same way. The sky went pink, then gold, then the blue that forgives. Coyotes called from far out where the land rolls into its own heart. Pearl slept in the rocker, a blanket kicked off and one hand open like she'd caught a piece of daylight and forgot to put it away. In years to come, people would say it started with a kindness. A poor woman, a cowboy, and a baby who needed a place to sleep. They made that one night stretch out, not by magic but by the small, daily work of it, warm biscuits, mended hinges, shared coffee, listening. Ada kept the quincho on her shelf. On dry days it flashed like a coin of sun, and on grey ones it held the light steady anyway. The door stayed open the way it had been that first evening, not so trouble could walk in, but so the wind could carry in the scent of rain and the laughter of neighbors. Love, it turned out, was not a sudden gallop but the sure-footed walk of people who chose not to leave. Under the cottonwood, they found they could rest, and the world, wide and wild as it was, felt like home.